Yeah. So good. So folks, we have had a wonderful start to our day. First, we had our presenter on the update, the research they've been doing around what's happening in Africa. And now we're going to move to the issue of governance. So I am going to be bringing on the speakers, and I think you're all there. So feel free to to could you please on Marlene and the other speaker, could you please open your mics? Thank you. Who is your other speaker?
Thank you. Good to see everybody again.
Yes.
Good morning, Dr. How are you?
And Anne, if you could please turn on your camera, Dr. Anne Agnew, could you turn on your camera, please, to make sure we're seeing you? Anne Agnew, could you turn on your camera, please, to make sure we're seeing you? Okay, I'm not sure where Anne is. Perhaps this is her here. Is this her one? No. She's here. So who is this? Is somebody she expecting? No. Okay. Okay, so Anne, if you could turn on your camera. Ah, there she is. All right.
So where am I? Where am I? Where am I? Hello. Perfect. All right, great. Can see everyone now.
Hi. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Natasha. Hi, Marlene. Hello, Anne. Etim is supposed to be joining us, but it might take him a little while. No, not that. Okay. So welcome to this panel session where we will be discussing governance in Africa. Let me just get the exact title. So, okay, yeah, exactly. The future of African space governance policies, partnerships, and principles. So this discussion really is about the changing landscape on the continent when it comes to space governance. A lot has happened over the past few months, especially with the African Space Agency being inaugurated. And of course, one of their key pillars is in providing this framework for governance in the space sector. So you all have very varying backgrounds. So what I will do first of all is ask for introductions before we go into the main meat of the day. So I'll start with Marlene. So I'll start with Marlene for your introduction.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. Right. It's so nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Dr. Marlene Oaseas. I'm a legal expert in international law and geostrategist when it comes to matters relating to the UN treaty regime, and that includes space law, rights, other.
Marlene, you're a bit muffled.
Muffled.
Yeah, it's a bit muffled.
Muffled. Okay.
Sometimes it's the headphones.
Still sounds muffled now. Maybe I'll just remove these. Is it better or
a bit better? Yeah.
Better. Okay. All right. So I advise public and private clients on participation in.
I think it's your headset.
Oh, okay, so let me that's then.
Yes. Yeah.
Just make sure they're off. Okay. Is this better now? Do you hear?
Perfect.
better.
Better. Okay, great. Yes. So I advise different public and private clients on participation in international forums and also the development of domestic laws, particularly as they model or adjust into the international legal framework. And one of the areas that I work particularly with is advising states on the issues of the UN COPUOS, so the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and its 5 treaties. And in order to incorporate those space laws into either an expanding or initiating domestic regime of laws and policies. And this is a very exciting time. Especially for the African continent, as so many states are developing their own space policies, and then the regional networks that are being developed, particularly through the African Space Agency. And well, I think this is a very timely discussion to really discuss the capacity building and to see what potential there is for the continent, and what type of partnerships, as you highlighted, would be ideal in order to build those capacities both at the domestic, regional, continental level, and also to establish them within the international framework. But I think key to all of that is to develop those policies with maintaining the autonomy and independence of the nation state. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to participating in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over to Natasha, just to do a brief introduction.
Hi everybody. Thanks for that, Marlene. There's 2 things that resonate there with me about the sovereignty aspect and then capability as well. I operate within the intersections of international standards, compliance, and then capability and capacity dynamics. So I don't necessarily have a core function, as it were. So I'm very non-traditional and non-linear, and deal a lot with dynamics in the space sector or space industry. So I'm also a member of the Space Sustainability Task Force with the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics. So I contribute sort of quality management frameworks and compliance frameworks to that. So essentially mapping out all of these complications and complex interactions between all the priorities, not just on a national level, but also, I said, going down to company level, the various segments, upstream, midstream, and downstream, and as well as continental. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Alma, and great to see some familiar faces again as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Anne Aggie, could you do a brief introduction? Oh, you're muted.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Great.
Yeah. Hi. It's an honor to be here. My name is Anne Aggie. I'm a lecturer at the University of Calabar, where I teach space law, intellectual property law, criminal law. My foray into space was actually accidental, where I had the privilege of taking my students for a space law competition at the IAC a couple of years ago. And you know, when you have to coach students for a competition, you have to study, you have to get to know, all things space. So I like to call myself the accidental space lawyer, because I didn't set out to learn about space. It was foisted on me. I was just appointed a student's advisor and coach. But since that time, I have had to stay relevant, because I've continued to coach students over the years. We've continued to win some of these competitions. And I've gone on ahead to co-found an NGO on space education and awareness. And we also work on collaborations with governments and the private sector to push the message of space to our communities. I'm Nigerian, and what you'll hear most times is we've not finished solving our problems at home. And then you're talking of going up to space. So it's a lot more difficult in my community to, convince people to even listen to what we are saying. It seems like we are just talking about things that are abstract, So my work basically is I spend a lot of time doing space awareness. I spend a lot of time teaching on space law and policy, and trying to encourage the academia to ensure that space law and policy is embedded in our curriculum. I also spend quite a lot of time. I also run a space law club and a space club at my university. So I try to get the young minds really, really interested in the space community. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all for your introductions. And so now we're going to just dive right into it. I mean, everything you said individually and collectively feeds into what we're discussing today. So I'm going to start off by asking, we all understand that the for space governance is ever changing, perhaps a little bit more. But what do you believe are the current gaps from your perspective and your backgrounds, your experiences in the African space government framework as is? So I'm going to start with Natasha.
Thanks, Alma. Yes, I think in my view, there's legislative gaps that still persist across the continent. There's, I believe, only a handful of countries who actually, for instance, Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, and Egypt, if I recall, have comprehensive national policy legislation. Most African states operate under the general telecommunications or science laws, but not space-specific frameworks. And this inconsistency really creates regulatory uncertainty, for want of a better word, for both, domestic stakeholders and, of course, international operators, as we see a lot of it unfolding in deal-making recently as well across the continent. While most African states are signatories, obviously, to the core UN space treaties, how these international obligations are translated and enforced domestically, it varies considerably. So this patchwork of regulatory environment really hinders the efforts towards continental coordination. So addressing these gaps is pretty imperative for us. And, especially if we want to have an Africa that's cohesive, have an influential voice, and especially in space governance. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just follow on from that, Natasha, because I know you do a lot of work in relation to standards, like ISO standards, etc. So what role do you feel these intergovernmental bodies like ISO framework?
Okay, international standards is really sort of a little bit of a jokey way of say it. It's a cheaper way to deal with competition, and it's really benchmarking. There's something to be said for that. It's really, I like to go into sort of companies and so forth, and when we talk about instilling standards for them to gain certification, for instance, that's just the absolute basic. I'd like to encourage that as their very minimum benchmark. And then what I do is actually work with them to take their uniqueness and see what their specific identity is, using that as a minimal benchmark. So standards as a whole really inform the framework or the rules of the game to allow everybody, in my view, a degree of fair access. And it's really about managing expectations realistically. I'm very much one who is supportive and advocating for practicalities with regards to implementation and so forth. We're great at making and writing out policies across the continent, but the implementability of that is really still of a concern. And I find that the channels that are offered through international standards and of course, even some degree of compliance frameworks really helps us answer a majority of those issues. Obviously, people see it as a hindrance, a must-have, a kind of, do I really need to? But it's a certification issue. If they really see it's an enabler, then we're A for away.
Fantastic. So I'm going to go back to the initial question, but to Marlene. So looking into the continent from outside, what would you say are the current gaps in the governance frameworks on the continent?
Okay, so I would say from an outside perspective, the gaps really are one that I think would present as we mentioned earlier, sense of patchwork type of composition. There lacks a consistency within the established each domestic framework, and also there lacks a consistency in the collaboration of those domestic frameworks with each other and with international forums. So that gap, in my view, can be filled by capacity building, communication, partnerships, both at the domestic, regional, and international levels. I think what is key to keep in mind, however, is that although this may be the state of affairs, it isn't necessarily a deficit that speaks more to anything but the development of technologies and the growth of the international geopolitical structure. So if we recall, the space industry really started to develop in the 1960s and between the United States and the USSR. There was a large, I would say, lacuna in the development, whether of technology or regulation, until about 2015, 2016, where in the US there was a law that was implemented which allowed private investors to profit from their investments in space, which really accelerated the investment in space technologies and caused an almost domino effect of similar laws in other countries like Luxembourg and Japan. And so we saw a big boom in the investment of space technologies. And in that big boom, there was a big growth in the space industry. And with the growth in the space industry, I think that's what we're seeing now with all of the space travel, the availability of space technologies. But as often is the case, the law is lagging, generally speaking. And so this is where we are, not just in Africa, but in many countries, and in many regions of the world. So I think that's very important to identify that this is a very natural progression. Now, what can be done is to ensure that the next step comes in timely and comes in effectively, which is exactly what we're discussing. And to do that, it's important to understand how this process has been done in different areas, especially areas that are framed within the UN treaty regime, for example, for cultural heritage, in terms of cultural laws that deal with movable or immovable objects. We were in a similar position maybe 10, 15 years ago, and we see that those lacunas, that patchwork framework, has been developed, but that is as a result of a lot of capacity building. And we see that, for example, at the level of the UN and UNOSA, the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, that provides a lot of those capacity building opportunities for states in Africa. The issue is that now there's a very long line of states waiting for that type of capacity building, which, although is a very high quality, there needs to be more of it. And so I think in order to fill in that gap, especially due to the budgetary crisis within the UN, is for that capacity building to happen within the continent and to be led by different African states, or even universities or private forums that could come in and help fill that gap in a more timely fashion, so that there can be the filling in of that patchwork and a greater opportunities for collaboration within the continent. And when that happens, that's essential. And I think that the inauguration of the African Space Agency was key, because once the African Space Agency really comes to function in the hoped way, the strength in that would be the leveraging capacity that Africa would gain vis-a-vis other regions and other institutions. And I think that leveraging capacity at the continental level will be instrumental and will be what would allow us to see the grand capacity and the successes of Africa as a continent within 5, 20, 30, 50 years. But the leveraging capacity is key, and that requires communication and partnership within the domestic systems and within the regional, continental regional systems.
Okay, thank you, Marlene. Now, I'm happy that you ended with, mention of the domestication of a lot of these, of the capacity, etc. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Anne, because you've done a lot of work in Nigeria, working with the space agency here, and like you said earlier, also in your personal capacity through your space education initiatives. So what are some of the challenges with regards to the existing frameworks that we have for space governance here in Nigeria, using it as perhaps a case study for other African countries?
Thank you very much. I think our first problem is that we are relying on outdated laws. Since our the Nigerian Space Research and Development Agency Act was passed a couple of years ago, it's upon that we base most of our space infrastructure, most of our space work on. The space community has moved on far from it, but we are still trying to get a Space Act promulgated. It's still at the National Assembly, presently called the Space Bill. Until we can get that act to work, we are still dealing with too many outdated things. We have to begin to talk about things like space liability, space debris, which are the current things we are discussing, the environmental sustenance, so we need laws to cover that. And then there's very minimal private sector partnership with us, with the laws as we have them now. So we're going to need legislation that encourages the private sector to partner with us, to partner with the Nigerian Space Agency. And then there's also an issue of fragmented policy issues. The policies in Nigeria as regards space law are often lodged in places like, the Ministry of Science or Communications Ministry. So there's no coordination. For instance, we have what we call the space agency that Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, for instance, we have the space agency that you know about, regulating issues of space. And that's under the Ministry of Science and Technology. Then we have the Nigerian Communication Satellite Limited, in charge of our satellites, which is domiciled with the Ministry of Communication. So lots of times, getting these two ministries to coordinate, you usually have a lag or some sort of conflict because you're running around two different ministers whose ideologies may not be the same as yours. And then another challenge and gap I see in our laws are issues concerning enforcement. Our enforcement issues are really, really still developing. So national policies are very disconnected from continental policies and even from national space policies. So we seem to be doing things in isolation, although we try. We try to attend conferences, but when we are done with those conferences and we come home, applying most of what we have learned is always a struggle. And I say this as someone who has usually tried to engage with the space agency. When you come home with those ideas, you're full of ideas, you're excited, you want to get them rolling. It's not as easy as you think, because now you're running from one ministry to the other. You're trying to get a government agent who probably didn't go for this conference you went to, interested in what you're doing. So those are all the challenges we tend to see. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Natasha, you wanted to chime in on that?
Yes, if I may. Excellent points there from both Dr. Anne in terms of legacy systems, and then Marlene and that as well, especially in terms of the communicative aspect that you spoke about as well. And obviously so many, I'm already forgetting them now. But just out of interest, in one of the lectures I do with the African Space Leadership Institute is on Africa space identity, which is sort of mapping out all the dynamics involved in the space industry, the things that contribute to a unique identity or sovereign claim access to space, and also again the measurement and evaluation of how, where everybody is in that sort of in comparison, if you will, although everybody is fairly unique. But I've established 4 foundational principles that help us to figure these dynamics out as to where we're sitting with it, and in terms of governance frameworks, that because it is so diverse. And essentially, it works out to an SETP, with it first with sustainability. Where do we sit on that framework in terms of equity, in terms of transparency, and then, of course, peaceful use. So having a look at the foundational principles when we're talking about practicalities is pretty important to engaging or positioning an argument, with regards to the disparity in some of these systems. So you sparked a real inspiration there for me, Dr. Anne and Marlene, on those 2 points. So I had to just share with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, whilst I have you, Natasha, because I was going to speak about this African space identity. Thankfully, you've given us some of the pillars that constitute that identity. Now, I'd like you to elaborate on how this translates into how we do partnerships. Okay, like from my legal background, for instance, we practice common law here, as Dr. Anne, you're aware. And okay, that entails perhaps wearing a wig and a gown in very hot climates, which for me really does not make any sense. So we seem to be adopting hook, line, and sinker, methods that, may not be necessarily appropriate for our given climate. So I'd like you to elaborate on how best to apply that African space identity to our governance frameworks. And then also I'll speak to you a little bit later, Marlene, about how we can perhaps infuse that into what UNOSA is doing as well. Okay, so I'll start with Natasha.
Okay, fascinating. Very loaded question there, Elma. In me working out, it was the Africans developing the Africa space identity was really a journey was still continuing. It's a very organic journey. As the space industry grows, we know it's growing super fast. It's really difficult for us to keep our hands and our fingers on the pulse, if you will. So we're forced to manage trends and patterns involved in this. But again, even these trends and patterns are based on these foundational aspect of it. So again, we're looking at sort of non-linear systems, positive reinforcement loops, and so forth. And in analyzing all of this, I really use the systems thinking approach, cybernetics-based approach with this. But in terms of your first question about how we engage with collaborations and so forth as well, before we get to do that, we have to understand what our sovereign capabilities and capacities are within every nation. We have to understand how each nation's history has informed their current status or state of doing things. It's absolutely essential to gain an appreciation of that. Now, Marlene touched on it earlier about this communicative aspect, communication. Now, psychological or sociopsychologically, I've worked out the 2 concepts that inform this time, or inform the ways we do things uniquely in different nations, is based on 2 aspects called cultural memory and communicative memory. Now, this is beyond technical capacity. Africa's space identity must rest on cultural memory and communicative memory. We need the technical competence, for instance, to compete globally, certainly, but also the cultural grounding that makes our space endeavors uniquely African and sustainable. There's a key word there. So I like to say space identity is sort of memory in motion. Our communicative memory injects urgency, a degree of relevance, and of course social justice into these space activities that we work on. This makes it meaningful to African citizens. So our cultural memory, sorry, I alluded to that, really offers this timeless wisdom, this sense of belonging, and of course our cosmological grounding. We can't leave that out of the whole equation. So basically together these memories ensure, our space identity is not simply an imitation of global models, but it's rooted, it's resilient, and I dare say even sort of revolutionary. So if we can understand those dynamics on the basis, we can then set an argument for or against certain aspects, and it informs the degree of collaborations that we have internationally and that technology transfer. I hope I've answered your question and not introduced too many additional topics there, Alma.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. So Marlene, you had mentioned some of the capacity building efforts that UNOSA undertakes, especially in the area of space law. I know very recently there was a UNOSA delegation to Ghana to help with the know-how in the area of space law development. So going back to what Natasha just said and remaining true to your cultural roots and your identities, do you believe that this is the best way to actually bring emerging nations, especially perhaps on the continent, up to speed on space law? Or do you believe it should be more bottom up, like having more input from local knowledge into the development of our own space ecosystems?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think one thing that needs to be recognized is that we're discussing a subject that was born from an international forum. So that was born from, I guess, the space race, as I mentioned before, between the US and the USSR. And from that was born a dynamic that encouraged a collaboration of the development of treaties and an international forum at the United Nations. So that necessarily entails an international framework. So there is a structure around which all things space emerge and revolve. And it's very important to understand what that structure is, how it developed, what its status quo is, and the ways in which it's evolving. Because based on that international framework, each country must develop its own domestic policy, and in developing its own domestic policy and objectives and laws, I think that's where the opportunity for individual sovereign identity develops. But it must be based on the international framework. That is not to say that it must mimic any other state's framework, or it must mimic any other state's space identity. However, the framework of the history of space, the space industry, the history of the space law framework must be understood. And this is very key, how those laws are being developed, because earlier in the conversation, one of my very esteemed colleagues mentioned that some of the laws are outdated. I think perhaps maybe that must have been Dr. Ann. And that is true because the technology is developed. And so we are currently in the process at the UN, at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, to develop those rules which must catch up and provide a basis of consistency and a basis for collaboration between the international community. And there is some frustration with that development because it's slow, perhaps because it's not as informed due to the form in which it exists, which is the UN. So there are some efforts to accelerate that collaboration, for example, with Artemis Accords, which are a US-based system of bilateral agreements. They're not multilateral agreement. They're based on bilateral agreements, based on a document derived by the US and signed bilaterally between different countries. And I think now we're about 50 countries. And there's another collaboration, of course, led by China and Russia. And so these are also now competing collaborations to advance this international framework around which individual sovereign identities can be developed. The problem is this multidisciplinary complexity of it, because we do run into an issue of conventional law versus customary law. And for those who are familiar with that, especially for those who are not, what that means is that once we have the written law, we all understood that that is a law. However, when there's a customer practice that doesn't necessarily match what that written law is, the question then becomes, which is the prominent law? Which is the law that applies? The written law, which was collaborated and agreed upon by that the plurality of states at the UN, or does it become the law that's practiced by one or two or three countries? And then you have a competition between the law that was developed by only a few states or the law that was developed by the UN and that form. So that is a very complex issue that must be followed by each domestic state, because that will eventually inform its own space policy and its own space identity. So I guess that's the first part of the question and answer, that all policies and all identities must understand the international and geopolitical framework, and then from there extract. So there are a few basic laws or principles which must be adapted in order to create that collaboration and consistency. And then there's the opportunity to develop sovereign policies and objectives. And I think those policies and objectives, those capacities must be borne by the interests of each state. And I think there is an opportunity to see something very fantastic for each state to really delve into the history of their contribution to space development and technologies, because it's not something that just happened maybe 10 years ago or even 50 years ago. Many communities around the world throughout time have contributed to state our capacity for space development, whether it's, especially for example, in regions like the west coast of Africa, and particularly in Nigeria, the development of metallurgy. So metals and how metals have come to be essential for space travel, or the development of telescopes, the understanding of the stars, the movement of the planets. All of that has been essential to the human capacity for space development. So it doesn't necessarily become that identity of one country or another. And I think that's one way to create a lot of pride and to derive a lot of basis for continuing to develop that identity. And once the needs of the particular state are identified, whether it's for satellite usage, for protection of the shores or agriculture, or whatever the case may be, those domestic laws can then become more specialized, more specific. And I think Dr. Ann also touched on a great point. The way that many countries are established in terms of their governing structures, they are distinct, but because that's the way perhaps things have worked. But because space is really multilateral, it's very interdisciplinary. We have to learn the capacity to work in a very multidisciplinary method, and that means communication between different ministries. And I think, a prime example is, for example, Article 9 of the Artemis Accords. And Article 9 deals with particularly cultural heritage, and that means that the ministry dealing with cultural heritage to the Nigerian Museums and Monuments Commission necessarily should speak with the Space Agency. And I've had the great opportunity to meet both of the DGs from those ministries, and there's no communication and there's no understanding of what one does and what the other does, which is very typical. For example, in Italy, the same, where you have two agencies that may be very strong or on the rise and have a great amount of capacity. So this is not just a unique, for example, to the African continent, but even a country in other regions where those communications have to be had in order to extract that capacity, that strength. And particularly in Nigeria, I would say there's a strength in the Nigerian Space Agency and the National Commission for Museum and Monuments. Excellent attorneys and legal specialists and diplomats that can really bring Nigeria to the forefront in those discussions for Article 9, for instance. And this happens, and I think with a lot of the other subject areas within space, but I think one of the things we have to understand is that it has to be a collaborative understanding of those different capacities within the countries, within country, and then also the strengths within the region, whether it's the equatorial states, the states that have more capacity for launching geospatial positioning. Then there can be more collaboration between one domestic state and another, but there is so much opportunity, I think, on the African continent. But what is essential is, yes, it is important to gain that universal understanding, and I think UNOSA is excellent for that. But once that understanding is gained, then there needs to be a lot of capacity building on the domestic level and the regional level, both with individuals in country, colleagues within the continent. And I think one thing that is going to be very key is the use of the diaspora to really bring in those capacities. And so some countries, for example, again, Italy, so this is not specific necessarily to the African continent, are trying to call back members of the diaspora to bring back all the capacities that they've learned perhaps outside back to country, and to make use of it for independent, autonomous, sovereign policies. And that has to be key in the identity, the sovereignty, and the autonomy of the state, particularly, for example, with the, in my view, the ownership and the operations of satellite systems. It must be autonomous, and the sovereign capacity, sovereign independence must be maintained.
Okay, thank you, Marlene. That was very extensive. We'll probably discuss offline about the diaspora and the legalities of some of that. But you mentioned the need for capacity building, especially if you want to build from the bottom up. Now, Dr. Ad, how do you feel that academia and research can help build the capacity for effective governance in the space arena?
Sorry, just a quick one before I delve into answering your question. I also happen to be at a workshop. I don't know if you can see this, for the Cross River State Government and NIGECOMSAT. And we are discussing with about 150 youths on space technology for grassroots development. And when you asked the question about this identity, the African identity, it struck a chord, because just yesterday, when they asked the young people to state how they think satellites can serve our community, they listed things like they wanted satellite data to strengthen agriculture and food security. They wanted to connect remote schools and clinics, support disaster preparedness and environmental protection. They talked a lot about flooding. Calabar is a riverine area, so we have issues of flooding. And then protecting our cultural and environmental heritage from orbit. That was a surprise to us. So when I heard my last colleague talking about those things, some of them struck a chord, because some of the students had indeed mentioned it. In fact, when we saw someone ask a question about how we could protect our cultural heritage and what space could do about that, oh, okay, that was a new one. So you can see that Africa's youth are thinking outside the box on how to use space technology to, for our own unique African ways. So it's really important, like Dr. had said, that we look at our community benefits and not just what the international community will gain. Now, I believe your question was how the academia comes in at this stage. Was that what you asked?
Yes. How can the academia and research institutions, how can they help to build the capacity for effective governance?
Yes, in three ways. Number one, discussing policy changes, innovative policy ideas. Universities must continue to have conferences. We must continue to engage in exchange programs with our colleagues in other African countries and even outside the world for knowledge to be enhanced. So currently I'm working on a collaboration between the Beijing Institute of Technology and our law faculty at the University of Calabar, where we could have student exchanges. We would like to hear from the students, interact with them, and know how they think as regards space technology. Our students go over to China and then glean from them. So we're going to have to, for us to advocate for space governance models that work, we have to train the next generation of young people. First of all, they need to understand what space is. They need to know the benefits of space for our communities, and they need to know how to use space technology to solve everyday problems. And for that, we need to teach them policy initiatives that they can build on. So that's the first step. And then the second step is the kind of workshop I'm telling you about, where we've gathered a couple of youths and then teaching them practical. It's like a hackathon. So at the end of the day, we're going to have winners of a competition. We've told them to use space technology to develop solutions to problems in their community, which I told you they listed out yesterday. And it's really wonderful what's going on right now. I've just looked at an app developed on the spot because we have programmers here too. We have website designers. We are training with Night Concert. And a young man has told me about how his grandmother needed a drug and he had to drive around town, had to drive around Calabar looking for it. And so his idea for his group was to develop an app where you could just punch in the drug you want, and then it will take you right straight to the pharmacy, and then you can pick it up. And we gave them just 4 days. And before I came upstairs, that app was functional. You won't believe it. I am even amazed because I'm a lawyer, but these people, these web designers are really good. And once you fire up the spirit of the young, they can do exploits. So that's another way the university is partnering with the government agency and the private sector. And then most importantly, for me, we engage in a lot of student space competitions. Students are driven by goals, So what we discovered is, if you want a student to study, so you tell him there's a competition coming up and he needs to study so and so. And I don't know if it's the prize, I don't know if it's just the thrill of being a winner, but we realize that they are very engaged. They get very interested and, for instance, on Monday when we began this program, it was tedious. The trainers were training them, they were tired, it was a long day. The youth have very short attention spans. But as we progressed, we noticed something odd. They began to tease each other. Oh, my group is far gone, you're way behind. Oh, we've done this, I hear you people haven't done that. So you could see that they were now interested. Our goal at the end of this workshop is that we're not going to leave them the way we have, the level we have trained them to. We're going to keep interfacing with them. So between now and the end of the year, we should have about 150 youths that can change their communities, and we will keep interfacing with them so they keep getting interested in space. And we began the training by giving them the basics. Oh, what is space technology? What is space law, space policy? This is how you think. So we are hoping that they can branch off, engage people, and then get them more interested in space. And then there's the issue of writing papers, writing books. I've written a couple of books on space law, which has gotten people more interested. Before I joined the university community, I don't think anybody had in my university. So in our library, there was nothing on space law. But since I did write a book, my students have bought a couple. They are more knowledgeable because they have studied that book. So these are some of the things we do: space conferences, space law, space education, MOUs with international universities for student exchange programs, writing articles on space law. So these are some of the strategies that we do.
Right, thank you, Dr. Ann. Marlene, I can see your hand up. We are short on time, so I'm going to, first of all, see if there are any questions in the room. Okay, okay, come on.
Right, thank you to the panelists. My question is directed to Dr. Ann. You're talking earlier about the nature of policy we have in Nigeria. The thing about poor fragmented policy in Nigeria is no longer news. We sit around the table and talk about it all day. So the problem is understood, but my question is, what are the practical roles, especially for young researchers, to be part of this effort to drive sustainable environment through policy implementation, effective policy implementation in Nigeria and Africa at large?
Okay. Oh, I think Dr. Ann dropped off the call. Okay, she's
Was
back.
that for me?
Yes. So it was
Okay, so that's an interesting. Sorry, someone is speaking now, so I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we
Can
can.
you hear me?
Yes.
So, that's an interesting question because I also run an NGO called Learn Space Foundation. So just last year, we were able to broker a deal between the Nigerian Space Agency and an organization called SERA, Space Exploration Research Agency. So what is the MOU about? About sending a Nigerian to space. And the focus of that NGO, of that partnership is we want a Nigerian in space to be a young person, a young researcher. So what we are building right now is a system where when we launch, young Nigerians can apply to be the first astronaut in space. They will be trained, and the Nigerian who wins that arrangement will be taken up to space. Part of this work we are doing with young people is to ensure that they communicate with us and tell us what their needs are as regards space technology. So there's something in the works. I assure the young man who just asked the question, where young people can come and partake and give their quota to the space technology. So if he can engage with me after this, I can give him some more opportunities.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to just call for final remarks as our time is fast spent. I'll start with Marlene. Maybe you can add in your comments as well.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much again for this wonderful opportunity. It's been such an engaging conversation and so nice to hear about the different perspectives and the work that's being done. I didn't mention in my introduction, but I am the chair of two committees at the International Astronautical Federation, the IAF, which runs the IAC, the International Astronautical Congress. I think that Dr. Ann mentioned that she had been to. And one of those committees, I'm the co-vice chair of the committee for the liaison between developing nations and international organizations. And these forums are excellent opportunities, particularly just even outside even that committee at the IAF for the young people, like Dr. Ann was mentioning, to collaborate with each other. So it is like absolutely extraordinary to see that capacity, that human capacity at the local level, and really incorporating the history and the cultures that bring these ideas and bring them to realization. But it's also very fascinating to see how different communities come together in these events, for example, at the IAC, and discuss. And I think that is essential, especially because the world is so international and space is necessarily geopolitical. The one issue is the ability to get to these different forms. Virtual is wonderful, for example, on this platform. But if there can be a way that there can be resources put aside, particularly for young people to travel to these conferences, to meet other young people, and then to come back to their communities and use those additional resources. I think that also builds the partnerships for the future. But it's a very exciting time. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope to meet all of my colleagues here in person soon, particularly in Nigeria would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Natasha?
Wow, that was lovely. I've really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation today. It's such a pity we don't have more time, but I think it's pretty clear. It's clear that this, how can I say this whole initiative, and that is really about young Africans, who don't see space as an exclusive domain, but almost as a birthright. That's sort of the philosophical sentiment that I'm getting from all of this. In truth, space is no longer what they say a distant frontier. It's really a powerful enabler of transformation for our communities especially, and we mustn't lose sight of that. We can only realize this when important aspects like access, equity, and of course, responsible stewardship that we're chatting about guide these collective actions. I think when we're building Africa's space identity, on sound governance principles and cultural grounding and multidimensional capital investment, which we haven't touched on, we create more than, I think, a space sector. I think we create a new, again, forgive me for the philosophical edge, a chapter in Africa's development story. So I think this is our moment to ensure Africa's voice in space is strong. It must be authoritative, of course, and ultimately transformative. So thank you very much. This has been a really interesting event. Oma, thanks for moderating as well. And to my colleagues, lovely e-meeting you. I would also love to meet you again soon, someday soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Natasha. And finally, Dr. Anne.
Very, very much for having me here. As you can hear downstairs, it's been a busy week for me. I apologize for all the noise. But my final words to everybody, because I've seen some questions. Do you believe other continents will give Africa a chance to stand in the space ecosystem? Nobody has to give you anything. You have to take it.
Yeah.
Nobody gave me any. When I came into the space sector, I knew nothing. Like when I sit in the room and the tech guys are talking space CubeSats, I didn't even know what a CubeSat was. But then I had to study, then I had to listen to webinars like this, and then I learned. Nobody will give you anything. You have to be a disruptor. When you ask about whether people will listen to you, make your voice heard. Solve a problem in your little way and keep doing it. I kept doing my thing until I got noticed. I didn't ask for anybody's permission. I've never had to ask. So that's what I'm going to encourage. And then whatever your ideas are, please, when you come for functions like these, share them with people. They will call you up and then say, okay, for instance, let me just give you a final word. I'm coordinating this program in Cross River State only because I walked up to the Director General of Night Comsat at an event and said to her, this is what I do. I run a space law club, I met you at the university. And she said, oh, I'll get back to you. That was 2 years ago. I honestly thought she had forgotten about it. And then she calls me and says, oh, we have this idea. Can you? And here we are training 150 people. So just do what you need to do in the space sector, collaborate, and you get it done. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. A pleasure to meet Natasha and Marlene. If they share their details, we can keep in touch. Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. And dare I say, the future of space governance in Africa might just be female, given the constitution of this panel. So thank you all for your contributions. And we're going to move on to the next panel, which is actually speaking to some astronauts who coincidentally happen to be all female. But thank you so much for your contributions. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to see my cohort and fellow board member of the Caribbean Space Society. Dr. Marlin, thank you so much for continuing to hold the flag up high for those of us in the Caribbean. You didn't mention exactly which committees you're on, but I do hope you have made room for all the small island developing states, because we're making sure that the islands in Africa, Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros, are not forgotten. So I've been plotting with the Mauritians to make sure we're not forgotten. So this is very exciting news. I think there should be like a separate subsector of Africa for those small islands, because they have a very different need. And so we're going to push that through. This is why I think this relationship between what I'm is a person from the Caribbean, trying to get the space ecosystem around all the global south, specifically Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. And coming here, this is my third conference here in Africa. We began in Kenya, last year was Ghana, this year is Nigeria, and really building out the Space Futures collaborative concept, working on these three Pan-African projects. One is the AfConsat project, we have the Oaseas Space Habitat project, and the third is Space Dunia. Dunia is a Swahili word meaning world, a metaverse space where we can begin to put the content, we can share content, so our content and our future scenarios design can be done in the metaverse, so that, because we know travel is expensive, we have all these Nigeria space clubs and clubs popping up here then everywhere. We've got to find a way to bring people together more frequently without added cost. So thank you again, Dr. Ann, nice to meet you. Natasha Van Reen, nice to meet you, and Marlene.